In this, the 8th lesson in the course, A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, we discuss the introduction of statistical and mathematical analysis by economists trained in German and other European universities. What the leaders of empire-building nations needed was information, and the first generation of university-educated economists proved extremely useful in this regard. Economists were not yet regularly sitting in the councils of government, but since 1885, the new generation of German-trained economists had established their professional association in the United States, the American Economics Association. Founding members included Columbia University's E.R.A. Seligman and Johns Hopkins professor Richard T. Ely. After completing his education at Amherst College, John Bates Clark attended the universities of Heidelberg and Zurich. A few years after returning to the United States, he helped to form the American Economics Association. Among the leading economists on the European continent, Karl Nys, a professor of government at the universities of Freiburg and Heidelberg, excelled in statistical analysis. At the other end of the spectrum was Karl Menger, who earned his doctorate at the University of Krakow and eventually joined the faculty of the University of Vienna. Menger attracted a young and growing list of economists to the new Austrian school of economic thought. Not quite as famous today is another member of the Austrian school, Eugen Baum von Bawerk, who worked in the Austrian Ministry of Finance after a decade at the University of Innsbruck. In England, William Stanley Jevons claimed lasting fame for his development of the theory of marginal utility, but only after his death in 1882. Jevons was convinced that only by mathematical analysis could economics be made truly scientific. Leon Walras emerged as one of Europe's most accomplished, if largely ignored, mathematical economists. His reputation as an economist increased after leaving France for a professorship at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland in 1870, where he remained for 22 years. A major figure in England was Alfred Marshall. In 1883, he became a lecturer at University College, Oxford, then moved on to Cambridge, where he remained until retirement in 1908. Among his contributions was the use of graphical supply and demand curves to visually show the effects on the equilibrium price of goods and services as relationships change. Whether in the real world there is ever an equilibrium price for any good or service is coming into question by individuals who describe themselves as heterodox economists, or economists who hold views inconsistent with economic orthodoxy. Arthur Pigou was one of Alfred Marshall's most distinguished students, and he succeeded Marshall at Cambridge in 1908. Pigou was first and foremost a mathematician, and he used his skills to substantiate his adherence to utilitarian principles. With Marshall and others, the age of neoclassical economics had arrived, increasingly introducing mathematics to the presentation of complex theoretical models of markets. However, far more than the method of analysis was occurring. From this moment on, the Cartesian plane, or the Cartesian coordinate system, became the standard way to indicate the changing relationships between the supply of and demand for any good or service. Quadrant 1 is where these relationships are graphed for the simple reason that in this quadrant one finds all positive values. Common sense tells us we cannot consume more than we produce. An early heterodox economist who believes Henry George had much to say to us, Professor Mason Gaffney, emeritus from the University of California, wrote in 1994, "Neoclassical economics is the idiom of most economic discourse today. It is the paradigm that bends the twigs of young minds. Then it confines the fluorescence of older ones, like chicken wire shaping a topiary. It took form about 100 years ago, when Henry George and his reform proposals were a clear and present political danger and challenge to the landed and intellectual establishments of the world. The consequences, says Professor Gaffney, have been to undermine all efforts to remove deeply entrenched privileges from the socio-political arrangements in every society claiming a market-oriented economic system." He writes, "Neoclassical economics makes an ideal of choice. That sounds good and liberating and positive. In practice, however, it has become a new dismal science, a science of choice where most of the choices are bad. As policymakers, neoclassical economists present us with choices that are too often hard dilemmas. For efficiency, we must sacrifice equity. To attract business, we must lower taxes so much as to shut the libraries and starve the schools. To prevent inflation, we must keep an army of unfortunates unemployed. To make jobs, we must chew up land and pollute the world. To motivate workers, we must have unequal wealth. To raise productivity, we must fire people, and so on." If what Mason Gaffney says sounds too harsh to be objective, his criticisms are shared by a growing number of younger economics professors. For many tenured professors and others attached to economic think tanks, admitting bias or even error is difficult. As longtime Harvard University professor John Kenneth Galbraith observed in his 1987 book, Economics in Perspective, "Holding economics in the classical or neoclassical tradition, there is, first of all, the vested intellectual commitment to established belief. This is a powerful constraint. Few economists wish to reject what was accepted in their earlier education and subsequently defended and elaborated in their own teaching, writing, and scholarly discourse. To abandon what they have learned and taught is to admit to earlier error. This we all resist." Which leaves us to struggle for a clear understanding of why disastrous economic collapses occur and repeat. And this takes us to the end of Lesson 8.